The year was 1889, and the wind carried the scent of dry grass across the plains of Montana where silence and loneliness were part of a man's daily bread. Samuel Brandt had lived alone on his ranch for nearly 12 years. His only company, the creak of barn doors and the moan of the wind through the fence posts. His neighbors said he had the eyes of a man who had buried too much hope beneath the dirt and refused to dig it back up. He had written once to a mail order bride agency not because he believed in love, but because he believed in survival. A ranch needed a woman's hand, and a heart sometimes needed a soft voice even if it came from a stranger. When the stagecoach arrived that dusty afternoon, Samuel stood near the hitching post, his hat low, his heart unsteady. From inside stepped a woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, her dress plain but clean, her hands clasped as though she carried her whole life in her fingers. Her name was Clara May, and she had traveled over 1,000 miles to be the bride of a man she had never met. But fate is not always gentle. The man she was supposed to marry was not Samuel Brandt but a rancher from the neighboring county named Edward Tate. Edward stood beside Samuel that day, reading a letter with a scowl, his face red with irritation. "She's too old," he said bitterly to the postmaster who had arranged it. "This woman is not what was promised." The words cut the air like a whip and the crowd of men laughed. Uneasily as Clara looked down at her worn shoes, she was 38, not old enough to lose her dignity, but far too old for a man like Tate who had demanded youth as if it were a commodity. The postmaster stammered, trying to calm him, but Tate waved his hand and declared he would not take her. "Take her back," he said. "Let the agency find someone else." Clara stood silent, her hands trembling as she whispered an apology no one cared to hear. Samuel watched her closely, something in him stirring that had been asleep for years. When the stage driver began to reload her small trunk, Samuel took a step forward. "I will take her," he said quietly. The words made every head turn. Tate laughed. "You will take her, Brandt. She's not even yours." Samuel's gaze did not waver. "She's now," he replied, and for the first time in years, he felt something like fire in his chest. Clara looked at him with disbelief, unsure whether to feel grateful or ashamed. She tried to speak, but Samuel only tipped his hat and told her softly, "Come on now, let's get you off this dust." The drive back to his ranch was silent except for the rattle of the wagon wheels and the sound of her soft breathing beside him. The plains stretched endless before them, gold under the setting sun. Samuel had not spoken much to any woman since his mother's passing, but something about Clara's quiet composure made the silence between them comfortable. When they reached the ranch, he showed her the house, sturdy but weathered, built with his own hands. She looked at it like it was a palace. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Used to it," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe not for much longer." That night, she cooked with what little was in the pantry, and Samuel found himself eating slower, watching her move like she had been part of that kitchen all her life. After supper, she washed the dishes, and he mended the fire, both lost in thoughts they did not dare speak. Later, under the flickering lamplight, he finally asked her why she had agreed to be a mail-order bride at all. Her answer came gently, her eyes distant. "Because loneliness is a hunger, Mr. Brandt, and I was starving." He looked at her, his rough hands resting on the table. "I know that hunger too," he said. The wind outside sighed, like it carried secrets across the prairie. She told him about her past. Her husband lost to fever, a home taken by debt, years of working in kitchens and sewing shops until she had nothing left but the hope that someone, somewhere might still want her. Samuel said little, but his eyes told her everything. He understood loss. He understood being forgotten. When she finally rose to retire, he stood and said quietly, "You don't have to call me Mr. Brandt. Call me Samuel." She nodded with a faint smile. "Good night, Samuel." As she disappeared into the small guest room, he sat for a long while, listening to the old clock tick, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. The next morning, the sun poured through the window, warm and forgiving. Samuel found Clara outside feeding the chickens, her sleeves rolled up, her hair loose. She looked at peace. He watched her and realized that for the first time in years his house did not feel empty. But word travels fast in small towns, and by noon a few of his neighbors rode up. Curious to see the woman who had been sent back, they whispered among themselves, pitying her, mocking him. Samuel faced them squarely and said, "She is under my roof, and that is all that matters." When they left, Clara looked at him with tears. She tried to hide. "You didn't have to defend me," she whispered. He shook his head. "Maybe I did. Maybe I wanted to." That night, as the prairie winds howled, he found her sitting by the window, holding one of the letters she had written to the agency. Her eyes glistened as she said, "They said I was too old to be anyone's bride." He stepped closer and said softly, "Then just be mine." The words hung in the air, like a promise neither of them had expected to make, but both needed to hear. She looked up at him, searching his face for jest, but there was none. Only truth, only warmth, only the steady gaze of a man who had finally found what he didn't know he was missing. And as the firelight flickered against the walls, Clara realized she had not been sent back by fate, she had been sent home. The next morning the sky stretched, pale and endless above the Montana plains, and the wind carried the scent of hay and wood smoke. As Clara stepped out onto the porch, with a tin cup of coffee, warming her hands and her heart still, uncertain about what had begun between her and Samuel the night before, she had not slept. Much her thoughts tangled between disbelief and a quiet sense of belonging she had not known in years. Inside the house Samuel was already working repairing a loose board in the barn door, his movement steady and sure as always, yet his mind wandered back to the look in her eyes when he had told her to be his. He had not meant to say it, not like that, not as a sudden promise thrown into the firelight, but the words had come from a place too deep to silence. Over the following days they settled into a rhythm that felt older than memory. Clara rose with the sun and tended the hens, while Samuel mended fences and rode the pasture line. At noon they would meet by the porch, share bread and coffee and talk about little things, the weather, the horses, the stubborn cow that refused to stay penned. But beneath the small talk ran a current neither dared to name. The townsfolk had not forgotten her arrival, and whispers spread quickly through the small settlement that Samuel Brant had taken in a cast-off bride, too old for any man to want. Some laughed, others pitied, but none understood. One afternoon, when Clara rode into town to buy flour, she felt their stares like thorns pricking her skin. The general store clerk, a sharp-faced woman named Edith, looked her up and down and said, "You're the one Tate sent back." Clara kept her voice even and her chin high. "I'm the one Samuel Brant chose," she said. The words surprised even her, that they gave her a strange strength. When she returned to the ranch, Samuel noticed the tremor in her hands as she unpacked the supplies. "Rough day?" he asked. She nodded. "Folks talk. Let them," he said. "They don't know what's worth keeping." His voice carried such quiet conviction that she almost believed nothing in the world could touch her as long as he stood beside her. Weeks turned to months, and the two of them worked side by side through spring into summer. The land began to bloom again after the long drought, and with it something in their hearts. There were evenings when the air turned gold and Clara would sit on the porch sewing while Samuel played a slow tune on his harmonica, the sound drifting soft across the fields. Sometimes he caught her watching him, and she would look away blushing, like a girl, though she had long stopped feeling young. One night after supper, a storm rolled in sudden and fierce, rattling the windows. Samuel went out to secure the horses, and when he returned soaked to the bone, Clara was waiting by the door, a blanket in her hands. Without a word she reached up and draped it around his shoulders, her fingers brushing his neck, and in that moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He caught her hand gently, his eyes dark and searching. "Clara," he whispered. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. The storm howled outside, but inside the air grew warm with something unspoken. That night neither spoke of love, but both felt it, settling in the spaces between their heartbeats. The next morning the ranch was quiet, washed clean by rain. Samuel watched her moving through the kitchen, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, and he thought She had never looked more beautiful. As the weeks passed, the bond between them deepened into something solid and quiet like the land itself. They faced small troubles together, a sick calf, a broken fence, a letter from the agency asking if Clara wanted to be reassigned. She showed it to him without a word. He read it slowly, then tore it in half. "You belong here," he said. She smiled with tears in her eyes. "I know." That autumn brought hardship. Again a dry spell that threatened the crops and long nights that tested their resolve. Samuel worked himself near exhaustion, refusing help, but Clara stood firm beside him, cooking, tending to him, patching his torn shirts and whispering small prayers when he slept. One evening as he sat on the porch watching the dying sun, she came out and sat beside him, her hand resting lightly over his. "You saved me, Samuel," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, Clara, you saved me." They sat in silence, listening to the wind in the grass, until he turned to her and said, "I was a fool to think I needed someone young or new. What I needed was someone real." She smiled through her tears. "Then you have me." The next Sunday, he hitched the wagon and drove them into town. The same townsfolk who had whispered months ago watched in surprise as Samuel Brant walked straight to the small chapel with Clara on his arm. There was no fanfare, no crowd, only the preacher and the wind outside, but when he spoke his vows, his voice was steady and full. "I don't care what they call you," he said, "I call you mine." She answered simply, "And I call you home." Afterward they returned to the ranch, where the sky blazed orange over the hills, and the chickens scattered across the yard. Clara looked around and felt the ache in her chest ease for the first time in years. This was not the life she had expected, but it was the life she had been meant for. As night fell, they sat by the fire, their hands entwined. His rough and scarred, hers gentle but strong. He looked at her and said, "You know, Clara, the day you stepped off that stagecoach, I thought the Lord had sent you by mistake." She laughed softly. "Maybe he did, but I'm glad you didn't send me back." He smiled, "Never could have." And in that quiet house, where loneliness had once been the louder sound, only the heartbeat of love remained steady and sure like the wind over the open plains. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of love and courage from the Old West, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next journey across time and heart.